As the Yankees' one-handed pitcher stepped up to the mound, the Cleveland Indians weren't worried. Jim Abbott had failed to live up to the hype around him in his previous game against them, and the Indians were certain they were about to destroy him all over again. Jim's chest tightened, he wound up and threw the first pitch. It was a wild pitch, a terrible one to start the day. He threw the second, outside, too far away from the batter. A few more nervous throws and Kenny Lofton jogged to first base without even swinging. Jim had just given the fastest player on the Indians his first base free. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This was supposed to be Jim's chance to turn it all around. The moment he proved to everyone and himself that he had earned his place on the New York Yankees. Instead, he was crumbling. Standing in front of the Yankees' home crowd of over 27,000 fans, self-doubt plagued Jim's mind. Maybe he was overhyped. Maybe he simply couldn't keep up with the best in the world, just like the doubters in Little League and high school baseball had always told him. However, somewhere buried deep beneath the fear, Jim Abbott did still have hope. He had already come a long way. For a young boy who couldn't even tie his own shoes, the thought that he may one day play for a Major League Baseball team would have seemed like a total fantasy to Jim and his parents. Being born without a right hand and growing up in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of support available for Jim. Jim's parents had tried to assist him in combating his perceived disability through his youth, even fitting him with a prosthetic hook made of fiberglass and metal. But Jim hated it. It was heavy, clunky. The kids at school called him Captain Hook. Some of them recoiled when they saw him, and some even cried because his arm frightened them. So early on in Jim's life, he made a conscious choice to forego the clunky and rudimentary prosthetics that existed at the time, and instead face the world as he was, even if that meant occasionally tucking his right arm in his pocket to put others at ease. His parents did their best to instill in Jim the belief that he could achieve anything he set out to achieve, and his father even reframed his disability as a potential strength, telling him something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. What is taken away once will be given back twice. In other words, maybe the thing that made him different could actually be a gift. But Jim had a hard time accepting that when he couldn't even tie his own shoes. It seems like such a small thing, but for Jim, not being able to tie his own shoes was everything. His parents would triple knot his laces every morning and send him off with strict instructions. Don't untie your shoes for any reason. But inevitably, with play and running around, shoes come untied. And when they did, Jim had to ask his classmates for help. When you're trying to fit in, that's not ideal. Jim never wanted to feel like he had to rely on others for help. He was headstrong, and he refused to accept that he couldn't be like everyone else, regardless of his difference. So when a teacher took Jim aside during class one day and told him that he had come up with a way for Jim to tie his own shoes with only one hand, Jim listened. After seeing Jim struggle, the teacher, Don Clarkson, had been spending his own evenings at home coming up with a technique for tying shoelaces tightly with one hand. As a former NASA contractor, Don had a fascination with creative solutions to complex and unique problems, and he couldn't help but take up the challenge. So when he'd finally figured it out, Don put on a film for the rest of the class to watch, and he excitedly took Jim into the hallway to show him the technique. Jim watched as Don pulled up a chair, leaned down, and showed him the process he'd discovered. It was a small moment of kindness for Don, but it stuck with Jim for years. Because if someone would go to that much trouble for him, and his greatest struggles could really be solved with a bit of ingenuity and thinking outside the box, what else could be possible? Just like Mr. Clarkson, Jim's parents never treated his difference as a limitation, just as a challenge to overcome. No coddling, no special treatment, just the expectation that he would find a way, the same as anyone else. And so, behind his house in Flint, as each day he overcame new challenges he was faced with, Jim started dreaming big. He discovered a love for baseball, and in particular, he developed a fascination with the challenge of pitching. Of course, the actual pitching part wasn't really the challenge. Jim's coordination, dexterity, and strength in his left hand had been something he was basically forced to overdevelop since he was born. But the real challenge came after the moment of pitching. How was he going to catch the ball with no right hand to wear a baseball glove on? He certainly couldn't pitch the ball while wearing a glove on his left hand. And so, inspired by the ingenuity shown by his teacher, Jim started developing his own technique for handling his baseball glove. He'd stand in front of a brick wall in the backyard with a ball in his left hand and a baseball glove balanced on his right forearm. And for hours every day, he'd throw a ball against the wall. After each release, he'd switch the glove over as quickly as he could, from his right arm, slipping it onto his left hand. And then he'd catch the rebound, swap the glove back, and throw the ball again. His father helped him figure it all out. How to balance the glove on his forearm while he threw and then switch it to his hand in one fluid motion. It would eventually become known as the Abbott switch. And over time, it became second nature to him. When Jim finally pitched his first Little League game at 11 years old, the parents of other kids on the team were supportive, but a little skeptical of his abilities, nervous that he might be a burden on the team rather than an asset. However, Jim got to work quickly dispelling all of their concerns. In his first game, Jim threw inning after inning after inning without allowing a single hit. His team was winning by so many runs that the league's mercy rule kicked in, ending the game early to spare the other team further embarrassment. In future games where his opponents did manage to hit his pitches, the opposing teams seemed to all fall victim to the same strategy. Opposing team coaches who hadn't seen Jim play before consistently instructed their batters to bunt the ball straight back to Jim, under the impression that he wasn't going to be able to field the ball. But they too were proven wrong, with Jim's patented Abbott switch getting his glove onto his left hand almost before his pitch even touched his opponent's bat. Little League became high school baseball, and despite the doubters telling him he'd eventually get left behind, Jim continued performing at a high level, not just in pitching, but in batting too. He even eventually started exploring his ability in other sports. In his junior year, the head coach of the Flint Central football team rang Jim's house, begging him to give football a try too. After all, they needed a quarterback with a good throw, and Jim had one of the best. When he arrived at practice, they handed him a helmet, pads, and shoulder pads, and he didn't know how to put any of it on. Then he walked out onto the field and everyone else seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing. Jim felt completely lost and out of place. But just as he was considering walking away, the coaches stopped the entire practice and everyone focused their attention on Jim. They all took the time to help Jim figure out how he could take the snap, how he could receive the ball from the center to start each play. They worked it out together, coming up with another patented Abbott technique. They soon realized that if Jim used his right forearm and dipped down a little lower, he could secure the ball. It was the same lesson all over again. With the right adjustments, with people willing to think differently, Jim really could do anything he put his mind to. He became the starting quarterback and led Flint Central all the way to state semifinals. And all the while, he continued to dominate the baseball diamond too. In 1985, the Toronto Blue Jays noticed his incredible ability, and they drafted him in the 36th round of the Major League Baseball draft. On the surface, it seems like an incredible, inspirational success story. The boy with one hand who was accepted into Major League Baseball. So it surprised a lot of people when Jim turned the offer down. See, Jim didn't want to be seen as an inspiration. Jim didn't want his story to be one of charity and acceptance. Jim was on a mission to be one of the best players in the world. Not the greatest disabled player, but truly one of the greatest players in history, regardless of his limb difference. Being picked in the 36th round meant the team didn't see him as a top prospect. The impression was that they were taking a chance on him, or that they were potentially just using him as a publicity move. Not that they saw him as a truly formidable player. Jim felt like he had more to prove. He turned down their offer, along with the remarkably high $50,000 signing bonus, and instead, he accepted a baseball scholarship to the University of Michigan. At Michigan, Jim tore through the competition. Over 3 seasons, his team won 26 games and lost only 8. He also became the first baseball player in history to win the James E. Sullivan Award, given to the nation's top amateur athlete across all sports. Then he won the Golden Spikes Award as the best college baseball player in the country. The kid who had been a 36th round pick was now being recognized as one of the best amateur athletes in America. But an even bigger stage was waiting for him. Seoul, 1988, the Summer Olympics. Jim Abbott took the mound in the gold medal game against Japan. He pitched the entire game, all 9 innings, and the USA beat Japan 5-3. Millions of people around the world watched a pitcher with one hand dominate the best players in the world. After his incredible performance on the world stage, the California Angels drafted him in the first round, 8th overall, in that same year, and they brought him straight into the major leagues. No apprenticeship in the minor leagues like they'd usually do, just straight to the top. Jim was only the 16th player in the entire history of baseball to make that jump. He had well and truly proven himself. Jim had a really strong start to his MLB career, and from 1991 to 1992 in particular, he continued proving the Angels were right to believe in him. In 1991, he finished 3rd in the voting for the Cy Young Award, the prize given to the best pitcher in baseball that year. His earned run average, or ERA, the stat that measures how many runs a pitcher gives up per game, was 2.89, among the top ERAs in the league. And in 1992, Jim improved his ERA to 2.77. However, despite Jim's incredible performance, he finished the season with a personal record of only 7 wins and 15 losses. It wasn't really Jim's fault. The Angels simply weren't scoring enough runs to win games when he pitched, but the team, desperate to cut costs and rebuild their team, traded him anyway. However, the New York Yankees, focusing more on the ERA than the win-loss record, and seeing the diamond that the Angels seemed to be unable to see, traded 3 players to get Jim on their team. They expected him to help deliver a championship to the Bronx. All Jim ever wanted was to be a pitcher. He wanted to be judged by his performance on the mound and not by what made him different. But that continued to be an ongoing challenge for him. And in New York, it only got worse. Every single week, he received dozens of letters from families all around the world, parents writing on behalf of their sons and daughters who were born without hands. Boys and girls who discovered that somebody with one hand had made it to Major League Baseball. That somebody had proven it was possible. Hospital visits with disabled children became part of Jim's routine. At first, it felt meaningful, but as the pressure mounted, it started to feel like an obligation. Like a responsibility he didn't ask for, but he couldn't escape. Like he'd become commodified as the inspirational one-handed pitcher, and he felt like he was being glorified for his condition more so than his ability. And that weight was crushing him both personally and professionally. By September, he had 9 wins and 11 losses with the Yankees. His ERA had shot up massively to 4.31. It still wasn't terrible, but it was far from the elite number that made him such an appealing prospect for the Yankees. And to make matters worse, he'd lost about 2 miles per hour off his fastball over the course of the season. He couldn't overpower the hitters anymore. The Yankees' owner, George Steinbrenner, blamed Jim's struggles on his charity work. He said all those hospital visits with disabled children were distracting him from baseball. And Jim couldn't even fault George for saying that. It was starting to feel that way to Jim too. He so wanted to help everybody he could, but it was clear that this added expectation of him that wasn't an expectation on any other pitcher was pulling him away from his beloved sport. And it was starting to impede his practice and his focus. The media piled on. An article surfaced in the New York Times that described Jim as an underachiever. For Jim, that word cut deeper than anything else. After everything he'd accomplished, the Olympics, the gold medal, his impressive start to his MLB career, after everything he'd overcome, underachiever wasn't something Jim was used to being called. But in a weird way, it was kind of what Jim had always said that he wanted. Jim was being judged, maybe too harshly, for his dwindling performance on the field. There was no more sugarcoating or tempering of what was expected of him. Isn't that what he always wanted? To be treated like everybody else? maybe he'd already achieved everything he could. Jim tried to hold on to hope, but with each game, it felt harder and harder. And it all fell apart on August 29th, 1993 at Cleveland Stadium. The Indians had Kenny Lofton, one of the fastest players in baseball, and at that point, he was leading the league in his batting average. Then there was Carlos Baerga, who'd racked up 205 hits the season before, and Albert Bell, a power hitter who'd knocked 34 home runs the previous year. Jim didn't even last 4 innings. It was the worst performance of his entire season. The Yankees manager, Buck Showalter, walked to the mound and took the ball away from Jim. Jim walked off the field in silence. In the second inning, the Yankees trainer approached Showalter in the dugout. "We've got a problem," he said. Jim Abbott's left the building. Jim had changed into running shorts and an inconspicuous t-shirt, walked out of the stadium, and disappeared into the streets of Cleveland. For hours, he ran through the city, burning off the frustration and the humiliation. When Jim finally came back, covered in sweat, the game was long over. The Yankees had rallied and they won 14-8, but to Jim, that just fostered more doubt in his mind. He thought maybe the team doesn't need him after all. Maybe he really was just a burden on the team. For the next 5 days, he carried that weight. The Yankees were only a game and a half behind the Toronto Blue Jays in a desperate fight to make the playoffs. Every game mattered. There was even talk in the clubhouse that maybe Jim should miss his next start. Buck Showalter was running out of patience. Everything came down to Saturday morning on September 4th, 1993. The Indians were coming to the Yankees' home ground in New York. But Jim Abbott had been thinking, and this time he had a plan. The sky over Yankee Stadium was overcast, 77 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 Celsius. Occasional rain was threatening to move in. Labor Day weekend was in full swing. The crowd that showed up was modest by Yankees standards, 27,225 fans. A lot of people had already left for the holiday weekend, and the morning showers had kept some people away, but it was still a significant crowd. Before the game, Jim Abbott sat down with his catcher, Matt Noakes, and the bullpen coach, Mark Connor. They needed to face reality. Jim had lost velocity on his fastball. He couldn't just rear back and overpower this lineup. They needed a different approach. And Jim certainly wasn't a stranger to thinking outside the box. They made a decision pre-game to throw more breaking balls, more sliders, to try to be a little bit more unpredictable. A bit more finesse over force. Jim walked to the mound. He could hear the home crowd murmur, nervous that Jim Abbott might be a burden on the team rather than an asset. He went into his windup, released the first pitch, and it sailed past the catcher all the way to the backstop. It was terrible. Jim was obviously cracking once again under the pressure of expectation. The crowd groaned. Jim could feel his chest tightening. Not now. Not like this, he thought to himself. He took a breath, tried to settle himself, but the next pitch was outside. Then another. A few more nervous throws and Kenny Lofton, one of the fastest players in baseball, jogged to first base without even swinging. The Indians' dugout was buzzing. Their fans in the stands were grinning. Jim stood on the mound, feeling the weight of it all, as the next batter, Felix Furman, stepped up to the plate. Jim pitched again, but this time the ball made contact. It was a hard ground ball. Wade Boggs at third scooped it, fired it to second. 1 out. The second baseman pivoted and threw it to first. 2 outs. A double play. Jim no longer had the pressure of a runner being on base. One more batter, Carlos Baerga, flew out to left field. The ball was caught, which made 3 outs, and the inning was over. Jim walked off the mound. He'd survived. In the third inning, the Yankees finally broke through. Dion James hit a single to center field, and then everything fell apart for Cleveland. The Indians' center fielder threw the ball back toward third base, trying to prevent the runners from advancing, but the throw came in awkwardly, and the third baseman, Jim Thome, couldn't handle it cleanly. The ball bounced off his glove and rolled away. One Yankee runner crossed home plate to score. Thome scrambled to pick up the loose ball near the dugout and fired it home, desperate to stop the second runner, but his throw sailed past the catcher and rolled into the Yankees' dugout. By the time the chaos ended, the Yankees had crossed home plate, giving them a 3-0 lead. And that's the moment the energy shifted for Jim Abbott. With a cushion like that, he felt he could comfortably execute his game plan. He didn't need to strike everyone out or throw unhittable pitches. He just needed to keep the batters on their toes and try to force mistakes, making the batters hit the ball on the ground or easy fly balls that his teammates could catch. He felt like he had room to breathe. When Jim did throw fastballs, he was throwing at 88 or 89 miles per hour, about 143 kilometers per hour. Not overpowering, but he was locating it well, mixing in his cutter, a pitch that moves slightly as it reaches the plate, and spinning his slider. In the fourth inning, Jim forced 3 straight groundouts, hits that go straight into the ground to be scooped up and thrown to first base before the runner can get there. Felix Fermin, Carlos Baerga, Albert Bell. It was a shutdown inning, and Jim had momentum on his side. With every throw, it felt like the ball was coming out of his hand a little bit better. In the fifth inning, Randy Velarde, the Yankees shortstop, crushed a solo home run to deep right center field. 4-0, Yankees. Jim was settling in. He wasn't dominating. By this point, he'd only technically struck out 2 batters himself, but he was doing something just as effective. His plan was working, and he was successfully getting the Indians to hit weak ground balls and lazy fly balls, pitches that looked hittable, but weren't quite where the batters really needed them. But as the 6th inning approached, that's when the energy in the entire Yankee Stadium began to shift. A whisper started spreading through the crowd. 0 hits. The Cleveland Indians hadn't actually recorded a single hit. Every time the Indians made contact with the ball, they got out from a catch or a throw to first base. In baseball, that's extraordinarily rare. A no-hitter happens maybe once or twice a season across all of Major League Baseball. Some pitchers play their entire careers without ever achieving one, and last time it happened at Yankee Stadium was 10 years earlier. In the Yankees dugout, the team were quietly exchanging knowing glances. The unwritten rule every player knows is that you never mention a no-hitter while it's happening. You don't want to jinx it. So Jim's teammates went completely silent, and they stopped talking to him between innings. The Indians were getting nervous too. This felt like an entirely different pitcher to the man they'd embarrassed 6 days ago in Cleveland. History felt within reach for Jim Abbott, and everyone in that stadium knew it. Carlos Baerga led off the 7th inning with a ground ball for the first out. Then Albert Bell stepped up to the plate. Bell was a dangerous player to be up against. He was a power hitter who'd smashed 34 home runs the previous season. Jim delivered his pitch. Bell made contact. He crushed a ground ball in the hole between shortstop and third base. It looked like the no-hitter was about to end, but at third base stood Wade Boggs. He launched himself diving at full extension, and he snagged the ball just before it shot past him into left field. Then, in one fluid motion, he sprang to his feet, fired a rocket across the diamond to first baseman Don Mattingly. The ball beat Bell by half a step. Out. The stadium erupted. The no-hitter was still alive. In the 8th inning, Jim struck out Manny Ramirez, and he'd now thrown 7 1/3 innings without giving up a single hit. Earlier that season, on May 29th, he'd actually made it to exactly this point in a game against the Chicago White Sox before Bo Jackson broke it up. However, this time, Jim kept going. 3 more outs. As Jim Abbott walked to the mound for the 9th inning, his legs barely had any feeling left in them. Goosebumps covered his forearms. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up. The Yankees fans were on their feet. Kenny Lofton stepped up to the plate to lead off the inning, but this time, instead of taking a full swing, Kenny Lofton tried something a little bit cheeky. He held his bat out and tried to tap the ball softly down the third base line, hoping to catch the defense off guard and get an easy hit. It's called a bunt, and in baseball, to attempt a bunt against a no-hitter in the 9th inning is considered incredibly disrespectful.
And he bunts foul. The fans don't like that.
Wade Boggs immediately moved up onto the infield grass, positioning himself to defend against a second bunt attempt. Lofton abandoned the bunt strategy, then hit a high-bouncing ground ball that came straight back toward the mound. Jim leapt, reaching up with his glove, but the ball sailed just over his outstretched hand. Thankfully, Mike Gallego, the second baseman, was right there. He fielded it cleanly and threw it to first. Out number 1 of the final inning, Felix Furman stepped up to the plate once again. The crowd was deafening. Jim could barely hear himself think. Furman fouled a couple pitches and then Jim threw the decider. Furman swung and connected cleanly. It looked like a hit that would shatter the dream and send everyone home disappointed. Centre fielder Bernie Williams had been playing shallow because Furman rarely hit the ball with power. But now he had to sprint a long way, tracking the ball against the overcast sky. Williams glided across the outfield grass, his legs pumping, his eyes locked on the ball. He made the catch, just a few strides in front of the warning track. It was the hardest hit ball of the entire day, and they'd caught it. 2 outs. In the dugout, Buck Showalter exhaled. He hadn't moved from his seat in 4 innings. Only 1 batter remained. Everything came down to this moment. Carlos Baerga stepped into the batter's box. Carlos boasted the most hits out of any player in his team. He thrived in big moments like this. The roar was pressing down on him from every direction. On the mound, Jim Abbott felt it too. He was on the precipice of something truly great. Not just great for a man with a limb difference, but a feat truly worthy of baseball's history books. Behind the plate, Matt Noakes crouched into position. The catcher who'd sat with Jim before the game and helped him figure out the new strategy. Complete trust between them. Jim wound up and delivered. Strike 1. Jim delivered the next pitch. Baerga swung, and this time he made contact. It was a ground ball rolling toward the shortstop Randy Velarde. The ball rolled into his glove as the crowd held its breath. Velarde set his feet and fired across the diamond to first base. The ball sailed through the air, straight into Don Mattingly's glove on first base.
He did it! He did it! No-hitter for Jim Abbott!
The celebration erupted. A celebration that had been building for a lifetime. A celebration of the boy who believed in something nobody thought was possible. A celebration of one of the greatest pitchers in MLB history. The next morning, fans were still celebrating 19 hours later. When Jim arrived at Yankee Stadium, crowds were 20 deep at the player's entrance. The stadium grounds crew approached him with a gift. They dug up the pitching rubber from the mound where he'd made history. Every teammate had signed it. The first no-hitter in 10 years. The 8th no-hitter in Yankees franchise history. And the New York Times called it the finest out of all of them. In the years that followed, several other stars followed in Jim Abbott's footsteps. Shaquem Griffin made it to the NFL. Nick Newell became an MMA champion. Carson Pickett became a soccer star on the US women's national team. Bethany Hamilton became one of the greatest surfers in the world. And to this day, Jim Abbott is recognized around the world as a symbol of possibility, grit, and adaptation, not only for those with limb differences, but for anyone with a dream of achieving great things.